You wound a buffalo in the tall grass, and it runs off into the bush. Standard procedure clearly says you wait, then follow the blood trail carefully. Except this particular animal didn't just run away. It circled back, hid in the thicket beside its own trail, and it's waiting for you to walk past. Okay, so most people picture African wildlife danger as lions, maybe crocodiles if they've watched enough nature documentaries. Nobody's first guess is the cow-looking thing grazing quietly and peacefully near a shaded watering hole, chewing grass with an expression that reads, to most modern eyes, as somewhere between bored and completely harmless. That's exactly the mistake that gets people killed, then and now. And it's a mistake that has almost nothing to do with a lack of information. There's plenty of information. It's a mistake of instinct, the same instinct that tells you a large, slow-moving herbivore standing in a field is by default one of the safer things you could encounter out there. So why does something built like an oversized cow terrify professional hunters more than an actual apex predator, the kind of animal every nature documentary treats as the undisputed king of the food chain? Because this animal doesn't just react to danger, it plans revenge, protects its wounded with a group strategy that borders on military, and has been doing exactly this to humans for longer than most of the scarier animals on the continent, quietly, without the reputation to match. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they set the stage for everything else. The African buffalo, Syncerus caffer, kills an estimated 200 people across the continent every year, which is why hunters gave it two separate nicknames, the Black Death and the Widowmaker. A mature bull can weigh over 2,000 pounds, run at speeds past 35 miles an hour, faster than almost any human alive over open ground, and carries a solid, fused shield of horn across its skull called a boss, dense enough to shrug off a rifle round that would drop most other animals outright. Its horns hook backward and up, purpose-built for exactly one motion, catching something on the ground and throwing it skyward, and then, if the animal is still standing and still angry, doing it again. The boss itself deserves a closer look, because it's not just thick skull bone the way a ram's horns are. In mature bulls, the two horn bases fuse together across the top of the skull into a single, continuous armored plate that can be more than 2 inches thick at its center, essentially a built-in helmet the animal carries into every confrontation. Hunters specifically avoid frontal shots on a mature bull for exactly this reason. A bullet that would drop almost any other animal on the continent can skid harmlessly off that plate if the angle isn't precise, which means the single most dangerous part of the animal's body is also, conveniently for the buffalo, the hardest part to actually stop with a weapon designed to stop things quickly. The physical mismatch here is worth sitting with for a second. A charging buffalo isn't just heavy, it's heavy and fast at the same time, a combination that very few large animals actually manage, since most animals built for raw mass sacrifice speed, and most animals built for speed sacrifice mass. Buffalo, for reasons that have made them a case study in their own right among wildlife biologists, kept both. That combination is exactly why professional hunters describe a buffalo charge as one of the few encounters in the natural world where there is genuinely no good outcome if you're standing directly in its path and don't have somewhere to go. Ancient and traditional communities living alongside buffalo across Africa developed real, tested strategies for this problem long before anyone had a rifle, let alone body armor. The San people of southern Africa, sometimes called the Bushmen, hunted buffalo using bows built almost comically small for the size of the prey, light enough that the arrow itself couldn't kill an animal that size through impact alone. The actual killing agent was poison, extracted from beetle larvae dug out of the ground near specific host plants, dried, and applied carefully to the arrowhead, with the point deliberately reversed in its shaft so the toxin stayed contained until the moment of the shot. Archaeological evidence puts poison arrow hunting in southern Africa back to roughly 24,000 years ago, meaning this exact toolkit, larva harvested from soil, poison prepared by hand, arrow reversed for safety, predates almost every other named technology on this list by a staggering margin. The poison itself was neurotoxic and worked slowly, sometimes taking a full day to bring down something as large as a buffalo, which meant hunters spent that entire day simply tracking, patient enough to let the poison do the actual work while staying far enough back to avoid a wounded, furious animal with nothing left to lose. Once the animal finally went down, hunters would carefully cut away and discard the flesh immediately around the wound, since the neurotoxin didn't spread through the entire body, and distribute everything else, meat, hide, bone marrow, across the group. Nothing about this process was rushed, and nothing about it left room for a second mistake. A day spent trailing a wounded, poisoned buffalo across open or wooded terrain was also a day spent genuinely vulnerable, since a buffalo doesn't necessarily go down quietly just because it's dying. Sand hunters weren't just managing the poison's slow timeline. They were managing an animal that, wounded, sometimes turns from prey into ambush predator without warning, just with a bow instead of a rifle and no vehicle to retreat to if things went wrong. That patience shows up again in the region's rock art. Sand rock paintings across southern Africa depict hunters wearing the heads and skins of buffalo and other game animals as disguise, close enough to a grazing herd to get within striking range without triggering the herd's collective defense instinct. Historical sources describe this practice directly. Hunters would don the actual head of the animal they were stalking, mimicking its movement and posture closely enough to walk among a herd that should have, by every instinct it had, recognized the threat immediately. Getting that close to an animal capable of calling in reinforcements from an entire herd wasn't just brave. It required a genuinely intimate understanding of how the animal moved, grazed, and reacted. Further north, in what's now the Sahara, engravings dating back roughly 12,000 to 6,000 years depict an extinct long-horned buffalo species, evidence that this same animal, or a close ancestor of it, was significant enough to entire cultures across the continent that they carved its likeness into stone thousands of years before anyone wrote a word down. Different regions, different climates, different hunting technologies entirely, and yet the same animal kept showing up as something worth immortalizing in permanent rock. There's a specific irony buried in that ancient relationship, and it's worth sitting with for a second. One that becomes obvious once you understand exactly what makes this animal so dangerous when wounded. The single most effective defense against a wounded, vengeful buffalo, it turns out, was never going to be a better weapon. It was time and distance. Exactly the two things a poison arrow bought you, and exactly the two things a modern hunter with a high-powered rifle sometimes doesn't have. Because a rifle can wound without killing just as easily as an arrow can, except now the enraged, several hundred-kilogram animal is coming at you within seconds instead of hours. Here's the part that separates buffalo from almost every other large animal on the continent, though. Most dangerous animals attack because you surprised them, cornered them, or threatened their young, and once the threat is gone, so is the aggression. A wounded buffalo behaves differently. Its documented behavior among professional hunters and trackers across multiple countries. An injured bull will run a short distance, then double back and conceal itself directly beside its own escape trail, waiting in ambush for whoever's following the blood. It isn't fleeing anymore. It's setting a trap for the specific creature that hurt it, and it has more patience for that trap than most humans have for anything. Trackers who've survived these encounters describe a specific, unnerving detail. The animal doesn't just hide anywhere convenient. It seems to specifically choose a position where it can see the trail before the trail can see it, angling itself so the first warning a tracker gets is often the charge itself, not the sound or smell that would normally give a large animal away. This isn't folklore passed down by hunters trying to sound impressive around a crackling campfire either. Professional hunting guides across East and Southern Africa treat the follow-up on a wounded buffalo as one of the single most dangerous moments in big game hunting, more dangerous than the initial shot itself, precisely because the animal's behavior stops being predictable the moment it's been hurt. Standard tracking protocol involves waiting, sometimes as long as several hours, before following blood, specifically to give a wounded bull time to either die from its wound or, just as often, to set up exactly the kind of ambush that's turned so many follow-up tracks into fatal encounters. Guides describe entering thick brush after a wounded buffalo as one of the few situations where every single rule of normal wildlife tracking gets inverted, because the animal you're following genuinely might already be positioned to charge from a distance of a few feet before anyone in the party sees it move. You're not hunting an animal running from you anymore. You're hunting an animal that's already decided you're the one being hunted. Think about what that actually requires. cognitively. Fleeing is instinct. Circling back to ambush your pursuer along a trail you just created yourself is something closer to strategy, and it's exactly why so many buffalo-related deaths in hunting records involve the second encounter, not the first shot. None of this happens in isolation either, and that's the detail that made the animal genuinely feared rather than just respected. Buffalo live in herds that can number in the hundreds, and the herd doesn't abandon a wounded or threatened member. There are multiple well-documented accounts of buffalo herds surrounding an injured herd mate and mounting a coordinated defense against actual predators, forcing lions, animals that supposedly rule the food chain, to retreat up a tree and stay there for hours until the herd finally lost interest and moved on. A lion, treed by cows. That single detail should completely reframe how you think about this animal. You're not dealing with a large, aggressive individual. You're dealing with a large, aggressive individual that has several hundred backup units willing to charge in on a shared grudge. Lion prides generally target the young, the old, or the isolated within a buffalo herd for exactly this reason, because a healthy adult surrounded by its own herd represents a fight the lions are statistically likely to lose, not win. Nature documentaries love showing the rare, spectacular case where a pride does successfully bring one down. What they show far less often is the much more common outcome: the herd noticing, closing ranks, and turning the hunters into the hunted for the better part of an afternoon. This herd-level coordination is exactly what separates a genuinely terrifying encounter from a merely dangerous one. A single wounded buffalo doubling back to ambush you is bad enough. A wounded buffalo whose herd is still within earshot, still capable of hearing distress calls and mobilizing, turns one bad decision into a scenario professional guides train specifically to avoid. There's a reason experienced trackers treat buffalo herds with more caution at close range than they treat actual predators. A predator, generally, is trying to solve a hunting problem and will often disengage once that problem looks unsolvable. A buffalo herd defending one of its own isn't solving a hunting problem. It's settling a score, and it has the numbers to make that settlement decisive. None of this ancient knowledge made the animal safe, and it's worth being honest about that. Buffalo attacks weren't rare misfortune stories passed down once a generation. Communities living near buffalo territory developed specific, inherited caution around watering holes and dense brush, the exact terrain where a lone bull, sometimes called a dagaboy, a term for older males who've left the herd and grown considerably more unpredictable and aggressive, was most likely to be encountered at close range with no warning at all. These solitary bulls deserve their own explanation, because they represent a genuinely different risk profile from the herd itself. As male buffalo age, they're gradually pushed out of the main herd's breeding hierarchy by younger, stronger bulls, and many end up living alone or in small bachelor groups, wallowing in mud, hence the nickname, referring to the reddish mud they coat themselves in. Without a herd's protection or its social structure to moderate behavior, these older bulls have nothing left to lose in the way a herd animal does, and hunters and trackers alike consider them significantly more dangerous per encounter than an animal embedded within a large group. A herd, ironically, has some built-in incentive toward caution, since a mass stampede risks trampling its own calves in the chaos. A lone, aging bull with declining status and nothing left to protect has no such restraint. For a farmer or herder working land near buffalo territory, this meant the danger wasn't uniform or predictable across the landscape. A large herd grazing in open country, visible from a distance, was manageable, something you simply gave a wide berth. A single dagaboy bedded down in dense riverine thicket, exactly the kind of shaded, water-adjacent terrain that both cattle and buffalo naturally gravitate toward, was an entirely different and far less visible threat, one that required intimate, inherited knowledge of local terrain to consistently avoid. Modern data actually helps explain something the ancient hunters clearly already understood on instinct. Buffalo aren't just dangerous when threatened, they're dangerous specifically because their aggression doesn't reliably de-escalate the way most animal encounters do. Professional trackers today still describe buffalo as the most unpredictable of Africa's so-called Big Five, more dangerous, encounter for encounter, than lion or leopard, precisely because a buffalo that decides you're a threat doesn't necessarily stop deciding that once you've backed away. There's a quieter, slower-burning version of this conflict too, one that has nothing to do with horns or ambush tactics. Buffalo can carry foot and mouth disease and bovine tuberculosis, both of which spread readily to domestic cattle sharing the same grazing land and watering holes. For any community whose entire wealth was measured in cattle, and across large parts of Africa historically it was, wealth, dowries, and social status all bound up directly in herd size, a buffalo herd grazing too close wasn't just a physical risk walking around on four legs. It was a slow, invisible threat to the herd that fed and defined the community, one that could wipe out a family's entire livestock wealth without a single confrontation ever happening. Communities that depended on cattle developed careful grazing rotations and watering schedules specifically to minimize overlap with wild buffalo territory, a form of risk management passed down through practical necessity long before anyone understood germ theory or had a word for a pathogen. Two completely different kinds of danger, one immediate and violent, one patient and biological, both radiating out from the exact same animal. Which brings up an obvious question. If this animal has been this dangerous, this consistently, for this long, why isn't it as mythologized and feared in popular culture as, say, the lion? Part of the answer is almost embarrassingly simple. Buffalo look like cattle. They graze in open fields, travel in placid-looking herds, and don't have a lion's obvious predatory silhouette. No fangs, no claws, nothing that reads instantly as weapon to someone glancing across a field. The threat is camouflaged by familiarity, dressed up as something domestic and boring, right up until the moment it isn't. This visual camouflage runs deeper than just appearance, too. Lions get cast as villains and kings in equal measure across countless cultures, precisely because they behave like predators are supposed to behave, stalking, pouncing, hunting with obvious intent. Buffalo don't fit that story. They spend most of their day doing exactly what a domestic cow does, grazing, standing in mud, occasionally swatting flies. The danger isn't in how the animal behaves 95% of the time. It's in the narrow, unpredictable window where something, an old wound, a threatened calf, a bull pushed too far from its herd, flips a switch that turns placid grazing behavior into something closer to premeditated violence. Cultures that lived closest to this animal understood that switch intimately, which is exactly why their oldest surviving records of it aren't myths about a monstrous beast, but practical, technical knowledge. Which plants make the poison, how long the poison takes, which terrain hides a dagaboy, how to disguise yourself well enough to get close without triggering the herd. No monster, just a very patient set of instructions. Which is really the whole point buried under the numbers and the nicknames. Humans didn't just fear this animal, they built an entire tracking discipline around it, generations deep, refined through poison chemistry, disguise, patience measured in full days rather than minutes, and hard-won knowledge about exactly which patch of brush might be hiding something that remembers being shot at. Not a legend, a manual, written in tracks, poison, and disguise instead of ink. That knowledge didn't come from studying a predator with an obvious, well-advertised threat profile. It came from studying something that looks, at a glance, like it should be harmless, and paying very close, very hard-earned attention to the narrow, unpredictable moments when it wasn't. In a strange way, the ancient technology solved a problem the modern one occasionally recreates, since speed isn't always the advantage it looks like. Sometimes the safest tool is the one that buys you an entire day to simply not be standing where the animal expects you to be. So the next time you see a photo of buffalo grazing peacefully at sunset, that image everyone associates with calm, pastoral Africa, remember that professional hunters rank this animal above lions on their personal fear list, that it kills roughly 200 people a year, and that somewhere in its skull is enough patience to wait beside its own trail for the person who shot it. If you've ever underestimated something because it looked too ordinary to be dangerous, drop your story in the comments. This one's been fooling people for at least 24,000 years, and it's still working.